Welcome to Facing the Canon. My guest on the programme is Stuart Bell, founding pastor of Alive Church, Lincoln. Stuart, welcome to Facing the Canon.
Thank you. It's great to connect.
I was trying to remember this morning, Stuart. I mean, we've known each other for several decades. And I'm thinking we may have met first time at the Evangelist Conference all those years ago. It was at one of those events.
Yeah. I looking back, it must be a number of years ago, and often we'd see you at sort of national events, but I've got to know you more recently.
More
which has
recently,
been a pleasure. Yeah.
Now you grew up in a Christian home. Your father was a preacher. What was that like growing up?
Yeah, my dad was a Methodist local preacher, and interestingly, as a boy, he used to take me, and this does age me somewhat, but on the crossbar of his bike to little Methodist chapels on Sunday evenings. And so it's a mixture of feeling, actually, because often you go to a chapel and there'd be a handful of people there and my dad would preach. So it wasn't always that lively. But from an early age, I really believed in God. My parents did a good job, I think, bringing us up. And so, my upbringing was very much church.
I remember once you saying, Stuart, that you remember being given your first Bible, I think when you were age 6.
Yeah, I've still got a copy of that. And the fun thing was, it was Christmas Day. I received it as a gift, and I was quite disappointed, if I'm honest, because it was a little authorized version with those indentations that made you find books quickly. And but I was struggling reading at that time, so perhaps I was expecting something different. But now, as I look back, and I occasionally open it, because in the front cover, my dad had written a verse and was really pointing me forward into ministry in many ways.
Absolutely. And then now, even though you're brought up within a Christian family and a Christian environment, of course, we all have to make that decision ourselves. And you went and heard an evangelist called John Wesley White. He was one of Billy Graham's associate evangelists. And what happened at that?
Yeah, it was in a Methodist church in the center of Lincoln, and the place was filled. And I remember he preached, and he had 3 sons that played musical instruments. It was a bit of a different thing. But I remember as he shared, though I'd been in church, from when I was very small, I was really impacted in a very deep way. And in typical Billy Graham fashion, he invited people to come to the front to respond to the gospel, and that's what I did that day.
And obviously that made a difference, because it was almost like a commitment that led to a submission.
Yes, I suppose for a while there was a kind of the church bit, and the other part, going to school, I perhaps kept my head down rather than being a great witness at the time. But certainly a decision had been made, and later in my journey, I suppose, that became more clear and the commitment stronger.
And you were quite musical. You played several different musical instruments, and then you and a bunch of friends, was it you birthed this band? Is it the Advocates?
Yeah, the Advocates. There were 4 of us, all in the same church. And when we began, we simply wanted to liven up services, and went around Methodist chapels. And it was in the days of the Beatles. So, we sang songs. But interestingly, we weren't always that welcomed in chapels. And so after a period of time, we started to venture out and do concerts in schools, and it began there.
But there are so many stories, Stuart, about how the Lord used the advocates. Wasn't there one meeting, Stuart, where you said if you wanted to receive Christ, stay behind, and everyone stayed behind, and you had to clarify that they understood what you had said?
That was at a time when I was speaking in Pittsburgh, and it was the season where we called it the Toronto Blessing,
Yes.
and God was moving by His Spirit. And I was in a very large gathering and offered prayer at the close of the meeting for any that wanted to stay behind. And as you say, everybody stayed. And so then I tried to activate prayer teams and took half of the congregation into a gymnasium up that was connected. And we were praying till I want to say 1:30 in the morning as people were being prayed for on that occasion.
Yes. Now you were together. Go back to the advocates. You were together.
Yeah.
Was it 11 years you were ministering?
Yes, and I think 7 of those were full time. So we left our jobs. I before that was
Yeah.
in local government for a period of time. We left our jobs and really did, in a sense, live by faith. We
Yes.
never charged. We never had fees and things, and God looked after us.
Now, what did you do after the advocates disbanded? What was the next season of ministry?
Yes, what I think happened was during the season when the advocates were involved, a number of young people were coming to faith, but we noticed that there was a gap between people coming to our concerts, finding faith, and then getting into church life. And what happened was in Lincoln, we went into a number of the schools across Lincoln. And in the evenings, we had concerts that they could come to. And during that week, there were around 30 young people responded to the gospel. And so we naively said, why don't you come to church with us on Sunday morning? And I think about half of them came, 15 or so, came to our Methodist chapel. And 2 things happened, really. The people weren't too happy with this young group that didn't quite know how to behave in church. But the second thing that happened was after the service, which was always an hour long, but sometimes felt a lot longer, these young people came and said, we can't really identify with what's happening here. We're interested in the Christian faith, but we're not really interested in church. So with the full permission of the Methodist Church, we were allowed on a Monday night to have a little gathering in the minister's vestry. And so in a simple way, we started to open up the Bible together. We sang some Christian songs of the time, which really only needed 3 guitar chords in those days. So we managed quite well. And we started to just share faith. It was kind of a mini alpha type of thing, a discipleship group. But actually, the room wasn't too conducive to the meeting. It was rather damp and smelt of gas, if you get the picture.
I do, yes.
And again, with the permission of the church, we started a little group in our home on a Friday evening. And so the same format, we studied the scriptures, sang, shared together in a kind of a circle in our home. And the meeting started to grow. The friends brought friends, and it wasn't long before our room was filled. In fact, there was a builder across the road, and we actually asked him if he could knock a wall down in our home to get more people in, which he did. And it was a fabulous time, really, as young people started to gather on Friday evenings. They brought friends. we had some remarkable times, and young people came to faith. And so it wasn't long before we're faced with the dilemma of we've got a full house. And in those days, it wasn't just come to a meeting on a Friday. These kids were coming at all times through the week. We had to set a few boundaries in because we just started a young family. But the beautiful thing was, I think we recognized that if the message was understood in a contemporary form, there was a huge interest, and the young people started to gather. And I always say we planted our first church by accident, really.
Yes. But how wonderful, opening your home, showing love and compassion, and people come to Christ. And then, of course, they need discipleship. And of course, the church grew and grew. I had the privilege of coming and preaching at your church actually quite recently. So currently, tell us about the church that you birthed.
Yeah, it's moved from, obviously in our home, it reached around 120 when we'd planted out into a hired premises. And then two churches came together in the city of Lincoln, and things started to grow. And actually now, as I look back, it is remarkable. It's amazing what the Lord's done, because now we have 6 locations. We've reinvented church on the way somewhat. It's now called a live church. When we first started in our home, we called it Lincoln Free Church. We didn't know what to call it. We wanted to be free, and we lived in Lincoln, so that was the obvious
Lincoln Free Church
thing to call it. And now a live church is a multi-site church in 6 locations. So we've 3 in Lincoln City, and then the others are around in the area.
But you do have a heart, both you and Irene, for where you live and your area, but you've had a heart for a wider area, and the whole ministry of what you call ground level, surface. What is ground level? When did that happen, and what was that about?
Yeah, well, when we planted that first church, it was interesting that across the area there were groups that were sort of gathering. Firstly, from the Methodist church, so a little group that were meeting in Grimsby contacted us and said, what's happening in Lincoln? Is it possible that something can happen in Grimsby? And then we got stories of people wanting to connect. And for a period of time also, we started to plant churches in the area. And in the early days, we kind of put together a vision, and we talked about having a cell group in every village, a congregation in every town, and a celebration in every city between the Humber and the Wash. And basically, we got that vision because leaders started to connect with us from Hull in the north, Kings Lynn in the south, and we framed this kind of vision of the Humber to the Wash. It was interesting, actually, because commercial local radio picked up on that phrase, which we believe we got first, from the Humber to the Wash. And that was the initial vision. But also we had a celebration that took place on the Lincolnshire Showground where we gathered the churches together. And that also began to grow. And so now, 40 plus years on, there are around 80 churches connecting together in what we call the ground level network. And so 2 years ago, I handed on the leadership of the network, and last May handed on the leadership of a live church. But I'm very much still connecting into both areas, and it's given me a little bit more freedom to actually come back to that first love in a sense. So Greater Lincolnshire area is still the place where I want to put my energies, if you like.
Now, amongst the books that I have of yours, Stuart, I have this one, Mud in the Eye.
Yeah.
And I was looking at it again yesterday, and all the photographs. We've had your son on Facing the Canon telling us the story,
Yeah.
but I'd love to hear the backstory from your perspective. What's the story behind this book?
Yes, I would say for much of our lives, we've been thoroughly blessed, great family, children, grandchildren, and so on. And, I often think that we've been, touched by God's goodness. But there was a particular season in our lives when it felt as though a page of a new chapter turned, and things, instead of going well, seemed to be a major challenge. And so Irene and I lost our parents in a particular space of time, and it felt as though there was a challenge to our lives. And one of those, the biggest we've faced, was when Dave, at the age of 16, we find has contracted a cancer, at the back of his eye, and we're faced with the issue of how you lead, believing in the power of God, healing ministry, and those kind of things, how you lead through a very challenging season. And we often say we didn't get the major breakthrough miracle where, hands were laid on him and the cancer left. But I genuinely feel we were peppered, if you like, with miracles through the story. And some of those are very, very personal. And one reason why Dave and I decided to put that book together was to share some of those stories, because usually when people face challenges, it's not a simple issue of you pray a prayer and it's sorted. Usually there is a journey to go on. And so we hope that through that book we've given a few principles. Some of them are very obvious. For instance, we had prayer teams that regularly prayed. We found that it was very easy for us to get into a kind of a maintenance mentality in the life of the church. And so we actually included other ministry people to carry weight while we were going through it. And our church leaders released us so that every time Dave went for treatment, we would be there.
Yes.
And we had to travel an hour and a quarter every time his treatment was in Leicester, and we had to travel from Lincoln to Leicester. And so we decided I was not going to be, a parent where I'm preaching and teaching and not involved in the life of my son. And so we gave ourselves to that process, and it was the hardest thing, obviously, that Dave's faced, but it was very hard for us as parents. And I think Dave would say he had to sort of lean on us quite strongly. And so what Dad said really mattered.
Yes.
And I was nervous to say things just, to make us feel better. I wanted, if I shared anything, to know that I was speaking sensibly, but also with faith.
Yes, I like the day that you had to go and see the consultant. You put on your suit, and Dave kind of commented, "Why, Dad? Why are you dressed up as if you're going to go to a wedding or something?" And what was it that you said to him?
That's one of those weird stories, isn't it? Where people say, I got up and God said, put your suit on. But I actually, and I've been over this in my mind, I actually feel that when I got up that morning, it was as though, it's hard to describe, but it was as though a strange authority seemed to be on me. And those moments don't come all the time. And I would say, I felt God say, put your suit on. And so when I put the suit on, I'm thinking this through, because I very seldom wear a suit unless I'm going to a wedding, and I certainly don't wear ties that much. So I put the shirt and tie on and the suit. And this was what was going through my mind. I'm going to be meeting with consultants, people that know what they're talking about in the health field. So maybe God's calling me to be a consultant in the area that I'm involved in. And it was as though I had to stand up on the inside, hold my head up. And I do believe that in that conversation, and we received pretty difficult news, but it felt as though we weren't just being driven by circumstances around us, but we were, in some measure, taking authority on the journey we were going to take.
Definitely. It's like the Lord has entrusted to you spiritual authority, and taking hold of that. And as you said, the diagnosis was not good, but the Lord reigned and ruled. And Dave didn't lose his sight. He's well, he's healthy, he's married, and has how many children?
4 children. Yeah, 4 miracle children, yeah.
And he's an anointed worship leader. And
well, he gets his gifts, of course, musically from his dad.
From his dad. And
he is blessed.
I love his recent song about healing. And I've sent that, Stuart, to so many people who are battling cancer at the moment. And so many, in fact, one lady who's had quite a terrible diagnosis, she says she listens to it every morning. That's the first song she listens to, just to kind of renew her faith and her mind.
That's wonderful. And but these stories come out of the reality of life and the mystery of some of these things. And we've certainly proved the faithfulness and the kindness of God. But we're also aware that not everybody gets the same kind of ending, the beautiful results that we've found ourselves with. And in fact, I went and shared 1 or 2 meetings with a pastor who had lost his son. And together we talked about the challenges of the journey. And both of us were, I believe, speaking from a position of faith in that. And I do know that because we've been through that journey, we are able to stand with and help people in a way that we wouldn't have been able to had those things not come our way. And certainly we wouldn't look for those things to happen, but in a very genuine way, a sense of care, compassion for people is very much came to us through that journey. And in fact, Irene particularly, because she was so strong in terms of faith demands almost. She was like a kind of a Rottweiler holding on to the promises of God, and now tears are always just under the surface.
Yes,
often with us both, because it's not that we're filled with sadness, but there is this sense of you being deeply touched by both God's grace, but also by the pains of suffering.
Absolutely, Stuart. So for you, Stuart, how many years in ministry so far?
Well, if we go back to the Advocates' days, it's over 50 years.
Yes, so half a century of ministry.
Yeah.
So obviously you look back with great gratitude to God for his faithfulness. Yeah. And as you look ahead into the next decade, for you, what's your expectation and hope?
Yes, I think Irene and I would be very conscious that there's a call on us to be kind of mums and dads or even grandparents, cheering on the next generation, being available to support and to help. The number of people that have come to us and said, what's it like to be retired? We kind of react to that because, in a sense, there's nothing in us that wants to retire in the technical sense of that. We understand what people are saying, but we want to be useful as long as we're here. And part of that, I think, is finding a new rhythm of ministry and life. it has actually allowed me over this last year to go around a number of ground level churches that I've not been able to go to before. I think I've done about 12 or 15 of those in the last year. So there are blessings with it. I'm freer to do that. And also some of those international connections we keep pretty strong. We've worked with a couple of teams into America and one into South Africa. And I've always felt that local churches need to have access to the bigger picture of what God's doing across the earth, you know, not getting locked into the small, but believing for greater things. And we've had this little phrase, partnership without ownership, you know, where we can
Yes.
partner with other teams and other ministries without feeling we've got to control things. We don't feel the end is yet, and we feel that there are other things that, you know, God wants us to do. And part of that is drawing together leaders from different denominations and areas. Some years ago, I started a thing called Partners for Influence, where we meet for a couple of days with leaders who have a national or an international perspective, because we've always felt that relationships are the key to the kingdom.
They are the key.
And too many people are on their own or lonely or independent. So I think our contribution is usually to try and connect people, connect generations, and connect nations at the moment as well, which is very exciting.
I love what you said, partnership without ownership. That is
Yeah.
so true. You know, we're just stewards, aren't we, of what God has
Yeah.
entrusted. Well, you and Irene, Stuart, are definitely not retired. You are refired. And may the Lord continue to do what he's done for half a century through you both. Honestly, you and Irene are such an inspiration to my wife, Killy, and I. And in fact, when we had lunch recently, you probably don't realize it, that, you know, the gems of wisdom that every now and again you throw one out. And I remember thinking, I better write that down when I went back to the hotel.
Oh, that's great.
I think sometimes we don't realize that actually we know quite a bit when we've been in ministry for half a century. Anyway, you're a real inspiration, Stuart. Thank you so much for coming on Facing the Canon.
That's very kind. Thanks so much.
I hope that's inspired you. Great listening to seasoned grandfathers of the faith. And you can read Stuart's story in his biography. Wonderful, it was so inspiring. Thank you for joining us on Facing the Canon. Please join us again.